Welcome to Free Bikes for Kids, and thank you for volunteering to help us provide a safe and reliable used bike to a kid. This short video will highlight the responsibilities and tasks for the mechanic after the bike has been properly cleaned and prepped. The goal of the mechanic is to make any and all final adjustments to the bike to make it roadworthy. The first thing we do is check the frame and the fork for any physical signs of damage. Slight damage can sometimes be corrected, but any cracking on the welds or the tubing itself is a concern and we should not proceed with a repair. Next thing we do is check the wheel for straightness and trueness. This generally can be done by simply adjusting the spokes. Then we check the tires for proper inflation. If a tire is abnormally low, we can safely assume it probably has a slow leak and we'll need to put a new inner tube in it. We also check for wear on the tire. Typically, the rear tires tend to be skidded quite a bit. That's generally not a problem, but if the tire is worn down to the cord or fabric material, that should be replaced with a newer used tire or a brand new tire. We now check that the wheels are rotating freely without any excessive binding. A slight amount of play is generally okay. This is a good example of a hub with a failed bearing retainer. This wheel will need to come off and we'll have to put a new bearing retainer in it. We also check the bottom bracket bearings on the crank. It is okay again to have a slight amount of play in the bearing, but there should not be any binding causing excessive resistance. Many times the manufacturers fail to tighten the lock nut securely, and often we see quite a bit of play in the crank or bottom bracket assembly. The headset bearing should be adjusted without any play in the fork itself. It's important because a loose fork will cause excessive rattling and uncomfortable ride. At the same time, you don't want the headset so tight that it's very hard to steer or turn the handlebars. Next, we'll check the chain for the proper tension. As you can see, this chain has excessive amount of slop in it. That can cause the chain to fall off the chainring or the rear cog. So we'll want to make sure we adjust that correctly. You want the chain to have just a slight amount of slop in it without binding in the tightest position. When we're checking the chain for proper tension, we're also paying attention to how dry or lubricated the chain is. This chain is in good condition, but many times we will receive a chain on a bike that has very, very tight links. As you can see in this example, this chain is very, very rusted and may or may not be loosened by lubricating. If lubrication does not correct the problem and keep the links freely moving, we must replace the chain. On a coaster brake bike, we want to make sure it has a brake strap that is securely fastened with a nut and a bolt. If the bike has a kickstand, it must be tight on the frame and easy to move up and down. We want to check both the stem and the handlebar bolts to make sure that they're secure and tight. We also check the minimum insertion mark to make sure that the stem is at the proper insertion. It's important to check both axle nuts are tight and secure. This will need to be done on both the front and the rear. We want to make sure that the saddle is tight, adjusted level with the ground, and we simply put a 14mm box and wrench on there to check and make sure everything is nice and secure. Some bikes have handbrakes. It's important to set up the handbrake properly for the rider. We don't want the brake lever too hard to pull, and we don't want the brake lever too far to make it difficult for the child to reach the brake lever and operate the brakes properly. We also want to make sure that the brake pads are fully engaged with the rim to give the best possible braking. We also check the cables to make sure there are no kinks, making it much more difficult for the operation of the brake. This particular bike has a side pull brake. They need to be adjusted properly so that their calipers are not loose, causing excessive play, but on the other hand, not so tight that the brake calipers do not return to their normal position. That's pretty much it for a single coaster brake bike. Now I'm going to show you some additional steps to check on a multi-speed bike. On multi-speed bikes, we spend a lot of time making sure everything is working correctly from the shifters to the derailleurs. The first thing we check is to make sure that the derailleur is engaging in each gear according to the shifter. If the bike is not shifting correctly, Likely it's a problem with the shifter itself or the cable in the housing, at which point we may end up replacing. We want to make sure that the derailleur limit screws are correctly adjusted. We don't want the derailleur to shift too far one way or the other. The last thing we need to do is ride the bike under a load. Many times it will operate differently with a load than on the repair stand. And we want to make sure that the gears and shifters are working correctly for the rider.